Well, hello for my full semester POLS 1113 I-92 class, and later on in this semester, as you'll be watching this, my second 8 weeks POLS 1113 I-93 class for the spring semester 2016. Glad to have you here. I'm Jeff Birdsong, the instructor for American Federal Government. We're now moving on in here to Chapter 3, Federalism. And this is a fascinating chapter. I hope you find all the chapters fascinating. This one in particular, to me, dealing with that interaction among three main levels of government that we have here in American government. We spend most of our time throughout this text and our discussions here talking about the federal government. But the federal government has responsibilities and limitations when it comes to its interaction with the state government and also with local governments. So the key in all of this is to consider which level of government has jurisdiction. And so here you can see a definition for jurisdiction: the power, right, or authority to interpret and apply the law. So which level of government in one particular situation, let's say, has jurisdiction? So would it be a federal issue? Would the federal government have jurisdiction, such as the Federal Bureau of Investigation? When would they have jurisdiction? When would a state highway patrol have jurisdiction? When would a county government have jurisdiction? This is an interesting county here, where this sheriff represents a county in Arizona that has a border with another country. So how about that interesting issue there, that you have a local government within a state, of course, which is part of a federal system, and yet it also then borders another federal system. It borders another government. So there you can see that perhaps some issues that this local government would be faced with may be different than some of the issues that other local governments may have to confront. And then you have within local government, county government, city government. Here you're looking at a picture of New York Police Department, some officers for the New York City Police, and think about the responsibilities that they would have, the number of people that are coming into New York City. Believe there's something like 9 million people in New York City, but on any given day there may be 20 million people within the boundaries of New York City. So a tremendous responsibility for the New York City Police Department. Now, when we think about state governments, one of the ways that we can consider state governments would be, what kind of differences are there among the states? There used to be a time in which one of the ways that you could measure these differences among the states would be on drinking laws. Increasingly, that's changed. There's not that much of a difference among many of the states. There can be differences on where alcohol might be sold and what type of alcohol can be sold where. That can be a difference. But in terms of drinking age, that pretty much has been solidified on what is the standard drinking age in every state. There was actually a lawsuit involving the state of Oklahoma on drinking age. This was back in 1976, so here we are, the 40th year since this court case, Craig v. Boren. And at one time then, in the state of Oklahoma, you had an uneven drinking age. So you had 18 for females and 21 for males. That was the drinking age. And this was then viewed, the people pressing the suit and bringing it to the Supreme Court argued that this was gender discrimination, as you can see, and it violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. This Equal Protection Clause will be something we'll discuss in great length in chapters 4 and 5. The majority of the Supreme Court, you have 9 people on the Supreme Court, a majority of them on the Supreme Court agreed that it was in fact gender discrimination. It was a violation of the 14th Amendment. So here was a case involving this state, Oklahoma. It was certainly a case involving federalism, where you had different laws in different states regarding drinking age. And it was also involving civil rights. It was involving, in this case, gender discrimination. To some degree, also, you could say age discrimination. And the courts agreed with that as well. So on the issue of drinking age, we had some changes occurring in the 1980s during the presidency of Ronald Reagan to reduce or increase the drinking age from 18 to 21 and try to have that as a universal age. But this was an interesting way of the federal government enacting a law without requiring states to do this. They suggested strongly that states do this, and that was part of the power of the federal government. In the National Drinking Age Act of 1984, the law stated that states that do not raise the drinking age to 21 will have a reduction in their federal highway funding. And so there you can see a way of the federal government having power over states, or having tremendous influence over states, to get them to follow what the national government would want them to do. National Drinking Age Act states that did not increase their drinking age to 21 would have their federal funding, highway funding, reduced. Now we're faced with this question in some circles that perhaps the drinking age needs to be reduced. And this becomes a public policy issue, that people are faced with binge drinking. Young people may be doing this and under the age of 21. And as a result, perhaps putting themselves in some dangerous situations. And so would there be less of a likelihood of binge drinking if the drinking age was reduced to 18? Not really sure about that, although there's about 100 college presidents across America, perhaps even more now. They're suggesting that that's what we need to do. We need to reduce the drinking age to 18. And part of that has been brought about because, unfortunately, there are cases of alcohol poisoning occurring on college campuses. And so from a health perspective, just to suggest that if you're vomiting as a result of drinking alcohol, if some of you are doing that, and I know many of you aren't, but if some of that situation is occurring, your body is rejecting the alcohol. You have gone beyond the stage of what is a healthy amount of alcohol. So certainly do keep that in mind. Please be aware of that and do your best to avoid something like binge drinking. Now, today, where we do see differences among the states has been on the issue of same-sex marriage. In many ways, this is, of course, out of date regarding the Supreme Court case, and we'll talk about that when we get into chapters 4 and 5, and certainly chapter 15. So this is, in a way, it predates that, and I'll give you a heads up about it. But we did see before then the Supreme Court case in 2014. There were some still variations among the states on the issue of same-sex marriage. And so that would have been a case also for federalism on what issues you have in some states versus others. Of course, one of the big questions for that would be if you allow for a marriage in one state, is that a contract? And then should that marriage be recognized if the people leave that state where the marriage was allowed and then move to another state where the marriage is not allowed? That becomes a legal challenge for sure. And of course, to add to this question is that certainly here in Oklahoma, we have another level of government, and that would be tribal governments. And so when we look at tribal governments, looking at the issue of would some tribal governments allow this form of marriage, and other tribal governments not, other levels of the government not allowing that. So another part of the complexity there. Where this becomes a question is, again, on the issue of a contract. So we have the full faith and credit clause. You can read about this on page 83 in your text. It's from Article 4, Section 1 of the Constitution. requires states to legally recognize official acts of other states. So this is where you're looking at the issue of if this is in fact a legal act, all right, an official act of a state, a marriage, is it to be recognized by other states? And so there we can see some of the complexities about marriage laws, and especially on the issue of same-sex marriage. Well, going back to the issue of the drinking age, here we can see the power of the federal government because they have more funding, and so the way that they use that funding and how they disperse the funding to state and local governments can be a way of creating more power. So using what's referred to as the term fiscal federalism, using federal money to influence state or local policy. And this is one of the ways to clearly show the power of the federal government. So think about the Drinking Age Act. The state doesn't want to raise its drinking age. That's a decision the state has to make, but it would result in a reduction in federal highway funding. Where the national government started to gain in greater prominence with funding comes from the 16th Amendment. This is the National Income Tax Amendment. I mean, the federal government had money in other forms before that. Tariffs were one of their main ways of acquiring funds. So taxing goods imported into the United States. But the national income tax was a way to have a very strong and fairly permanent source of income, in that case, source of funding for the federal government. Now, this is a very detailed chart, and it may be a little difficult to read. Might be something that you would like to pause and look over. What I like about this chart, and you will certainly see information in your chapter 3 that will discuss what roles you have among the three levels of government here, are the two, state and national government, is to look at the requirements of different levels. So, what's the power of the national government? That's listed here in red. What's the power of the state government? Listed in blue. And in gray would be a concurrent power, powers that both the state government and national government have. So many of these are fairly obvious to think of. You could only have the national government having that power. If you had the states have that power as well, it would really complicate governing. So tariffs, goods coming into the country, that's a national government power. Regulating trade among the states and foreign countries, that's a federal government power. Coining money, that's a federal government power. Maintaining the armed forces, that's a federal government power. Declaring war, a federal government power. Establishing post offices, a federal government power. And establishing courts, a federal government power, national government power. For state governments, taxing citizens, controlling public education, punishing criminals, protect public health and safety, conduct elections, establish local governments, and make marriage laws. That's a state government power. We can see some complications there, right? Make marriage laws, but what if there is a form of discrimination among the states, according to the 14th Amendment? Control public education, but what if there is now an interstate involvement with education? Does that then give the federal government a reason to be involved? And so there is then an area that involves both state and national government, and that's to maintain law and order. That's both a national and a state government area. Levy taxes, borrow money, take land for public use, and provide for the public welfare. Those would be requirements and powers for both the national and state government. So questions have been raised about court cases that clearly altered our structure of government and how people were taken care of. Well, provide welfare, for example. And this is in some ways under that umbrella. The court case Helbring versus Davis in 1937 deals with Social Security. When this started to be enacted, there was a question raised on whether it was constitutional. So is a national program for old age benefits, Social Security, it's one of the ways you can clearly describe Social Security, constitutional. And the court, as you can see there, majority opinion in the last bullet point, Benjamin Cardozo wrote the opinion, member of the Supreme Court, by a 7-2 vote. Their reasoning, according to the second bullet point there, it is constitutional because it is in response to a nationwide calamity that was unsolvable without a concerted federal effort. What kind of unevenness would occur in the country if you had different levels of benefits among the states for old age pensions or protections? And so there needed to be a uniformed approach to providing old age benefits. That's the argument in this court case, Helbring v. Davis. So again, that argument that a state-by-state system will create unevenness in benefits. So you need to have a federal approach to old age benefits. In many cases, when you're talking about a national policy, what has to happen is a process of implementation, and that's putting the policy to work. Once again, we're looking at this issue from the federal point of view, the national point of view, and you would have differences among the states, you'd have differences among local governments. So here we're talking about implementation, the term for that, putting a policy to work. How does that happen? And so here you can see the way that that's carried out, for example, in education. So you can have a policy at the national level, and now it has to be carried out, it has to be put to work. We're going to improve education, let's say. Now it's up to the states and people working within the states, teachers, administrators, to make that happen. So it's one thing to form a policy, it's another to make it happen, make it work, implementation. Here you have the textbook definition. Go on into the text on page 562 to read about that. The efforts of departments and agencies to translate laws into specific bureaucratic rules and actions. So to then carry out that definition at the state level and local level, you have departments and agencies among the states and among local governments within the states that have to translate these laws into specific bureaucratic rules and actions. So you can see from a national perspective, come up with a national policy to, again, let's say improve education. You have 50 separate states that are going to interpret that law, and then think of all the school districts within the states that are there to interpret that law. Lots of coordination that would have to be put into place at the national level for implementation to work. So in some cases, because of federalism, there's a need to try to iron out those differences, to try to come up with some flexibility. And in law enforcement, for example, what might take place is cross-deputization. This is certainly an issue when you have many tribal governments and tribal law enforcement agencies, as we certainly have here in Ottawa County. And for many of you taking this class in other counties here in Oklahoma, you probably have that in your counties as well. And so in many cases what is done is that you'll have these sheriff deputies working for a tribe. So they're cross-deputized. They're an Ottawa County sheriff, and they're also a Eastern Shawnee tribe police officer, for example, or Quapaw tribe police officer. So that's the process there of cross-deputization. It allows for more flexibility, more nimbleness, and allows then for a way to ensure that everyone's working from the same playbook in your county. When you think about tribal government, and again, that's a good segue from what we're just looking at for cross-deputization, most of the negotiations or the work that tribes have carried out with government has involved the federal government. And that, of course, goes back to the Constitution. So increasingly we're seeing ways in which tribal governments need to work with state governments or local governments. But that's a new experience. I mean, just throughout our history, it's been the federal government that the tribes have spent most of their time with. And that's, again, brought out in the Constitution. So Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. You can see here the power of Congress when it comes to commerce and regulating interstate commerce. So the Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. So that tells us right there in the Constitution, it's the U.S. Congress that the tribes will be working with. Now, we've already mentioned here through income taxes, the federal government can have a tremendous amount of funding, and then they can disperse that funding back to states or to states and local governments. And so you'll start to see on page 93 description there about grants, and there are different types of grants. And so we're going to spend some time here talking about these different types of grants. So there's the categorical project grant, and this grant has a narrow purpose, and the recipients must compete for the grant. So there's different viewpoints on what type of grants should be available in government and what are the most beneficial ways to disperse this money back. Is this the best way? A narrow purpose, and people must compete for the grant. So potential recipients must write grant proposals. And in these grant proposals, you can point out what is the need, who benefits, and how much funds will be spent to accomplish the goal. So these are questions that would need to be answered within the grant proposal. It's competitive, and how well someone writes a grant proposal will be very important to the success of getting that grant. But there's other types. There's the categorical formula grant. It's granted to a local or state government for a specific program. And there's the block grant, less narrowly defined, less strings attached. The city of Miami, Oklahoma, which is where I'm recording this lecture, 5-10 years ago, received a community development block grant. You see the initials of that there in the upper left-hand corner of the flag symbol that you have there on this chart. The community development block grant was in place to restructure downtown Miami. We used to have these curvaceous serpentine streets in Miami, and so that was changed to have just a straight downtown street system. And a grant was acquired to make that happen. So, and it was a block grant that was used for that. Well, you'll certainly see in the text ways in which there's been challenges to the power of the federal government and the interactions between the states. And so the Supreme Court, serving in this sense as a referee between state and national government, makes their determinations on what is the power of the national government. So in McCulloch v. Maryland, for example, certainly a landmark court case from 1819, a key segment of the Constitution was used in this court case, and that was the Commerce Clause. According to the Commerce Clause, it implies power to Congress, even before you review the Commerce Clause, to lay and collect taxes and to borrow money and to regulate commerce. So all of that suggests the power of Congress in the issue of benefiting or regulating commerce. And in this particular case was, can there be an established national bank? And there were representatives of the state of Maryland that were challenging that, believed that that was not a fair and proper role of the national government to establish a national bank. But the courts, as you'll read here on page 88, the Supreme Court determined that it was in fact a proper role, according to the Commerce Clause, and also according to the Necessary and Proper Clause. If you combine those two, then you're going to see many ways in which what the federal government does is in fact allowed. It is very elastic, as your text will suggest. So Article 1, Section 8, at the very end, lists the necessary and proper clause. To make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States. And certainly it's tempting to say that's the catch-all clause. Pretty much anything could fit in there. But that's still, based on a challenge, would be up to the Supreme Court to make that determination. The necessary and proper clause, also referred to as the elastic clause. So when you think about our banking system today, the idea of a national bank, we clearly have the Federal Reserve System. You can read about this on page 579 in your text. We have 12 district Federal Reserve banks responsible for adjusting the supply of money and credit, responsible for ensuring that banks do not overextend themselves. So here we can see the power of the federal government in regulating our banking system here in the United States. A lot of power given to the Federal Reserve. And this is why in our history we actually had one president who was opposed to the National Bank and did not reestablish the charter while he was president. That was Andrew Jackson, and believed that it was giving too much power to unelected bureaucrats working for the national banking system. And he may have certainly some good reasons to point that out. The reality, though, is after he did that, a few years after he left the White House, there was a terrible depression in the United States. And if you don't have this federal banking system, could it lead to a considerable unevenness in an inability for banks to remain solvent when they're hit with some bad decisions or just some bad local economic situations. And that may mean that people who put their money in that bank will not have their savings protected. And so there are some benefits, clearly, of having a federal banking system. And then we have the court case Gibbons v. Ogden. You can read about this on pages 88 and 89, and it dealt with the Hudson River and the relationship between New Jersey and New York. And the Commerce Clause once again was brought in. Could one state have a monopoly on a transportation system that involved a river and that bordered another state? And was it up to the state to make that decision, or was it the federal government? And once again, federal government wins in this court case, that its interstate commerce is regulated by federal government, not by a state government. And again, if you have more than one state involved, you have interstate commerce, and who would be best to do that regulation? Well, it's in the Constitution, but we need the Supreme Court to verify that through this court case, Gibbons v. Ogden. So certainly read through there, and a lot of interesting information in this chapter dealing with federalism, the interaction between especially the state and national government, but also at times the local government there as well. Well, this is Chapter 3. We'll be moving on to Civil Rights, Chapter 4, in our next recording.